I'm Richard Louie at MSNBC World Headquarters in New York City. We're going to start this hour for you with some breaking news if you're just joining us at the top of this hour. What could potentially be here the most extensive window yet into the thinking of President Trump's legal team when it comes to the Russia investigation. The New York Times revealing a confidential 20-page memo sent by Trump attorneys in January of this year to Special Counsel Robert Mueller. This article just being posted about an hour and a half ago. According to the Times, the memo contends that the president cannot illegally obstruct any aspect of the investigation into Russia's election meddling because the Constitution empowers him to, if he wished, terminate the inquiry or even exercise his power to pardon. Joining me now is one of the journalists with a byline who wrote this for us, and you can see there. It's great to see you. Charlie Savage, New York Times Washington correspondent, also an MSNBC contributor. Charlie, what stood out? Where do we start with this?
So this is a really remarkable document to see in real time as the fight between the president's lawyers and the special counsel over whether Mr. Trump will talk to the investigators or even face a subpoena if he doesn't want to do it voluntarily heats up. This is a lengthy, top-to-bottom defense of the president against the obstruction of justice accusations that he has been facing. It is an argument for why he cannot be subpoenaed as a matter of law, and it is an argument for why he cannot be accused of breaking laws against obstruction of justice no matter what, even if the evidence were to show that he had corrupt intent when he fired James Comey or told him not to go forward with investigating Michael Flynn. It doesn't matter because they are articulating a sweeping, novel theory of presidential power under the Constitution, under which he cannot be guilty of obstruction of justice because he runs the executive branch and all investigations are subject to his control.
Novel, Charlie. Also, as you have so well articulated for us and summarized on the article as well as the 20 pages, they seem to be making the argument that is he above the law? Is this what one might take away from the way it was written?
Well, that's the implication of theories that statutes that apply to everyone else in the United States do not apply to the president. Because the president is a unique figure in our country and in our government and in our legal system, he has powers that the Constitution assigned to him, and that makes it difficult for another branch of government, Congress, by passing statutes to infringe on those core authorities. This is part of what in that famous phrase from Watergate, when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. There are echoes of that here. The notion is that he runs the Justice Department, he oversees it, he's the commander-in-chief of the military, right. He's the law enforcement officer-in-chief. He can shut down any investigation he wants at any time. He can remove any subordinate official he wants to, and that is authority that he has. So when Congress makes it a crime to impede an investigation with corrupt intent, Congress lacks the authority to constrain him, even if it constrains everyone else in the country. This is a theory that's been floating around. I mentioned it in the context of Nixon, but there is no court precedent one way or the other to tell us whether or not the obstruction statutes apply to a president exercising his powers in an official capacity.
When you read through it, and it's lengthy, this is the physical copy. You can also turn it sideways if you wanted to get a sense of how thick it is. And this is the January memo. You also have the June memo, too. You put these two together. Does one supersede the other? Is there any shift in thinking over that time span?
The June memo, which was written to Mr. Mueller's team early on after his appointment, arose when word first began to filter out that in addition to investigating whether there was collusion with Russia in the 2016 election interference matter, that Mueller was also going to be looking at whether Trump obstructed justice in 2017 by interfering with that investigation and the Flynn matter and so forth. And so the lawyer, in that case, his legal team wrote an early memo to him saying, hey, here's why we think you shouldn't be looking at that at all. A lot of the constitutional arguments are in that earlier letter, and then the later letter, the much longer letter, incorporates that by reference, reiterates some of those, but also makes an array of other arguments that are more geared towards the immediate issue, which is whether the president should or can be forced to talk to Mueller before Mueller wraps up the instruction.
And as you know, because you're part of the Fantastic Four here that have been following this story so well, and when you look at the mood of June last year compared to January of this year, and even to today as we hop into another new month here, the tone also perhaps reflects the time, the context, right?
Well, yes, but also I don't. Although this letter is from January and the other one we got is from June, I don't want your listeners to think that this is old. This is foreshadowing and laying the groundwork for the issue that is particularly hot right now. We are reaching a climax in the negotiations between the special counsel's office and the president's legal team about whether he will talk to Mueller, and if not, whether Mueller will issue a subpoena to try to force him to talk. And so these arguments that they've been having privately are recorded in this letter, but months later, now is the moment when this stuff is really reaching a peak. And so it's really extraordinary to see this, documents get leaked all the time. This one is special. I found it quite fascinating to work through this because we're seeing exactly what it is they're saying to each other, and they're foreshadowing what the gigantic legal court battle will unfold if there is a subpoena and the president fights it in court. The arguments in this memo are what we're going to be seeing in the briefs filed in that battle to come.
Yeah, and we have, if this is the playbook right here, Charlie, you have been reporting, we've been following certainly those storylines that echo the thinking here going back to January, and as you're saying, very important given the day that we're at today as we look at the development of this very story on June 2nd. 2018. You mentioned the obstruction of justice statute, how the argument they're making here does not apply to FBI investigations. That's a pretty essential argument they're trying to make in this.
That's right. This is a really striking aspect of this because it goes to the quality of the legal advice the president is getting from the lawyers who are willing to work for him. They have a lot of arguments that center on a sort of technical, legalistic parsing of a particular federal statute against obstruction of justice, one that says it's a crime to impede an a pending proceeding. And there's a court ruling that says a mere FBI investigation doesn't count as such a proceeding because they're just gathering information, they're not adjudicating anything. And they also have some arguments that he didn't know necessarily at the time of his conversation with Comey about Flynn that the FBI was actively investigating Flynn, that there was a pending one at that point, so he couldn't have had the intent to interfere with it anyway. And all of those arguments are premised on the idea that the relevant law is this one I mentioned, Section 1505 of Title 18, which talks about pending proceedings. The problem is that that is an outdated understanding of obstruction law. Way back in 2002, as part of Sarbanes-Oxley Act, after the Enron accounting scandal and some other accounting scandals, Congress closed the loophole that if someone interfered with a witness or destroyed some evidence early on because they thought it might lead to legal trouble or because the FBI had just started looking at it but hadn't gotten very far, they could get away with it. In this 2002 law, Congress said it is a crime to impede a proceeding even if that proceeding has not yet started and is not even about to be started. And what that means is if you impede something that is a potential grand jury investigation, which is a proceeding, or a potential trial, which is a proceeding, even if it hasn't happened yet, that is still obstruction of justice. All of their arguments that are focused on, well, there was an FBI investigation, that doesn't count, or he didn't know there was an FBI investigation, are totally beside the point. And it's remarkable that lawyers who are advising the president didn't know that.
We're about to get some more lawyers in the conversation quickly, but I want to ask you this first here. Charlie, in terms of the new pieces of information that came out from this document, one might be the story of the president here. It seems like his lawyers are talking about dictation from the president to his son. Fill that in for us.
So one of the things that Mueller is looking at is a statement that the White House issued in the name of Donald Trump Jr. when the New York Times first broke the story about the famous Trump Tower meeting with the Russian lawyer and the fact that Donald Trump Jr. had been promised dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russian government and eagerly responded to that. In that sequence of the existence of this meeting, remember it took a while for all those details to come out, they put out a statement in Don Jr.'s name saying, oh yeah, we just talked about adoptions, and there was nothing to it. And there's been some suspicion that actually that statement was personally dictated by the president. And in this letter, they seem to acknowledge that, yes, he personally dictated that misleading statement, because we know that the meeting was actually premised on the idea that the Russian government was going to give dirt on Hillary Clinton to the campaign. And but they say, well, so what? It's not that's a personal matter between the president and the New York Times. In other words, it's not a crime for a politician to lie to the media, to lie to the public. So what business is it of yours, Bob Mueller? So that's their defense of that moment. What's interesting about this, of course, is Mueller is interested in that for other reasons, we think. One is if Trump, in personally, not just people around him, but the president, was personally trying to mislead the public and cover up these campaign ties to Russia, that could be evidence that he wanted to cover up campaign ties to Russia, and therefore evidence of his motivation and intention when he did other things, like pressure Comey to stop investigating Flynn or fire Comey or these other things as well. So even though that particular moment was between the public and the New York Times and the president, it could be evidence of other things. And the other thing that's relevant about that is that one of the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon talked about, as one of the items against him, lying to the public and trying to mislead the public about whether there was any there to the Watergate investigation. So even if it's not a crime in terms of federal statutes and what you could be prosecuted for in court, lying to the public about, there is precedent in American history for lies about an investigation like this to be part of what was the bill of particulars in an impeachment proceeding.
All right, Charlie, stand by. As always, great reporting. If you don't mind, for 2 or 3 minutes, we're going to bring in our legal panel. They're going to join us. Barbara McQuaid, Jack Rice, Nick Ackerman, all going to join Charlie Savage, as well as we are in this breaking news cycle right now, a revealing 20-page memo coming from the Trump legal team. We're going to dig deeper. Stick around.
Welcome back. I'm David Gura, updating you now on some breaking news. The New York Times releasing a report just moments ago that in a confidential memo to Special Counsel Robert Mueller, President Trump's lawyers claim executive power can exempt the president from being subpoenaed. With me now, NBC's Jeff Bennett, who is at the White House, Caitlin Jewett-Burns, national political reporter for Real Clear Politics, and Ozzie Barbera, he's a senior reporter for Politico New York. Jeff, let me start with you and just get your reaction to this. Of course, you've been toiling in these trenches for many months as well, talking to Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, trying to get some sense of the thinking that the president's legal team has vis-a-vis this interview, this sit-down with Bob Mueller and his team. Let me get your reaction to what you've read here. Again, what the Times has written about this memo and the memo itself. I should say the Times has put it up, all 20 pages of it with annotations. What's your reaction to it, Jeff?
Hey there, David. Well, we've seen for months the public pressure campaign the president and his allies have undertaken to discredit the Robert Mueller investigation. Even today, the president tweeting, suggesting that this is a fruitless pursuit, a costly pursuit, even as the Mueller investigation racks up indictments and really gives no suggestion that it's going to wind down anytime soon. But what this letter is, in black and white, that provides the legal underpinnings of what the Trump legal team has been telling us for months, that the president could not illegally obstruct any investigation, let alone the Russia investigation, because the Constitution gives him wide powers to shut down, if he wishes, any inquiry. So this is really a way that the Trump legal team is trying to limit the scope of a potential interview because they are concerned about the prospect of perjury. What's also notable, too, is that notice that this was hand-delivered by Jay Sekulow and John Dowd. John Dowd, of course, is the president's former lawyer who left the legal team in part because he did not want the president to sit for an interview with Robert Mueller and his investigators, and felt, Dowd did, that the president wasn't really taking all of his advice into account, David. There is one particular thing that stood out to me as I'm working my way through the letter. And remember, there were questions the special counsel had about just how intimately involved the president was in crafting the response to the now infamous Donald Trump Jr. Trump Tower meeting he had with the Russian lawyer and other Russian advocates. Well, the Trump legal team in this letter concedes that Mr. Trump dictated what they call a short but accurate statement, meaning President Trump himself dictated this response. Because remember, in the immediate aftermath, the White House gave multiple accounts for who was responsible for that statement, suggesting at one point that Hope Hicks, the former communications director, had a hand in it. Now we know that the president himself dictated that statement, which at the time, you'll remember, was all about this obscure Russian adoption policy, even though we now know that Donald Trump Jr. accepted that meeting with the hope of getting dirt on Hillary Clinton, David.
Jeff, stay with us. Ozzy, let me turn to you first. Jeff, they're mentioning something that caught his eye. Right. As you make your way through this, what stands out to you? Again, there are these 16 action items or things that the special counsel is, according to the president's attorneys, past and present, interested in honing in on. What caught your eye from the memo itself?
The two things that caught my eye is how they're trying to paint this as the president being so open and cooperative and voluntarily handing over so much information. And the second thing is that they're saying that all the information you would probably get out of an interview, we've already provided the documents for it, therefore no need. They're really making a public relations argument as to why the president doesn't even need an interview, why Mueller doesn't need to actually have this kind of meeting with the president. They're saying, look at the records, we've provided it all. To me, that is much more of a public relations argument than a legal argument.
Yeah, Caitlin, on that point, eager for you to chime in here with what you found most fascinating, but Jeff, they're saying you're seeing the intellectual underpinnings here of what the president's team is thinking. It is that, from what I've read, more so than the legal underpinnings. They're focused on what they're thinking and how it might be presented or portrayed to the American people.
And absolutely, and the fact that this is out there is also kind of indicative of what you were just talking about. It is really interesting that you've heard so many people in the legal community say that it would be completely unwise for the president to actually sit down with Robert Mueller, because this issue of perjury is a real concern among everybody who's been involved in this and following this. And we saw that just yesterday when the president was talking about North Korea. Very simple things, like I read the letter and the letter's great, and it turns out that he hadn't actually read the letter. So you can imagine him sitting down in this meeting with Mueller and completely, extending the scope of the investigation just by virtue of him sitting down with him.
Jeff, my producers have pulled a number of quotes here. I'm going to read a couple of them here, and I'm going to call them out by number just for ease here. The second quote I want to read here is, ensuring that the office remains sacred and above the fray of shifting political winds and gamesmanship is of critical importance. That, again, according to the president's personal attorneys. The third quote we've pulled here, the president's prime function as the chief executive ought not be hampered by requests for interview. They wrote, having him testify demeans the office of the president before the world. Again, Jeff, want to get your perspective on this, covering the White House day in and day out. This is giving us some insight here into how White House staffers see the White House, see the Trump White House.
Well, Rudy Giuliani said as much, suggesting that decision about the potential interview between the president and the special counsel investigators would have to wait until after the North Korea summit. Remember, that happened a couple of weeks ago. Giuliani suggesting that he didn't want the president's focus diverted from North